Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to travel back to ancient India.
Always fun.
Yeah. We're looking at, let's say, around 600 to 300 BCE.
Mm.
And what makes this period so interesting, I think, is that, you got this established Vedic traditions.
Right.
But then, like, boom, Buddhism and Jainism arrive on the scene.
Yeah, talk about a shakeup, right?
Really shaking things up.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to be looking at today, this real clash, but also a blending of these different philosophies. I think it's fair to say it's India's axial age.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And what's so fascinating is, this wasn't just some abstract debate. This was happening in people's lives. It was this dynamic process of, resistance for sure, but also synthesis and transformation.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder how people living through this time actually experienced this clash of ideologies. Like, how did it impact their daily lives?
Oh, absolutely. And that's something we'll definitely be exploring today.
Okay, so before we get into all the nitty-gritty, let's do a quick recap of those Vedic traditions.
That's good.
For listeners who maybe need a little refresher, we did do a whole deep dive on the Vedas back in Season 1, Episode 11.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say are some of the key takeaways from that episode that we should keep in mind as we jump into today's discussion?
Well, the first thing to remember is that the Vedas aren't just one book.
Right.
That
Definitely not.
It's actually a collection of 4 texts, right? The Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. And they're not exactly light reading either. They're full of poetry, metaphors, symbolism.
Yeah, you really have to kind of dig in and unpack all those layers of meaning.
Absolutely. And within those layers, you find these really core philosophical concepts that shaped the Vedic worldview.
Yeah.
Ideas like Brahman, the ultimate reality.
Right, the ground of being.
Exactly. And then there's Atman, the individual self, the soul, which was seen as essentially identical to Brahman.
So each individual carrying a spark of the divine within them. That's powerful stuff.
It is. And then, of course, you've got Dharma, the whole idea of duty, living a righteous life and aligning yourself with that cosmic order. And you can't forget about karma, the idea that actions have consequences playing out over lifetimes. This was the landscape that Buddhism and Jainism were entering.
All right, so let's bring in those new players, Buddhism and Jainism. Now, these weren't just adding a few new ideas to the mix. They challenged Vedic norms pretty significantly.
Oh, absolutely. Buddhism, with its emphasis on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, offered a path to escape suffering, which, suffering is kind of a big deal in Buddhism.
Right.
And then there's nirvana, the idea of achieving liberation from the whole cycle of rebirth. That was a pretty radical departure from the Vedic focus on fulfilling one's dharma within that cycle.
Yeah, no kidding. And what about their stance on the Vedic rituals and the authority of the priests? I'm guessing they weren't too keen on offering up sacrifices to Agni, the fire god?
No, not really. Both Buddhism and Jainism question the need for all those elaborate rituals. They offered alternative paths to liberation that didn't require a priestly intermediary.
So you've got these new ideas gaining traction. They're challenging the Vedic establishment. How did the Vedic folks react to all of this? Was it just all-out war? A philosophical battle to the death?
Well, it was definitely more complex than that. There was resistance for sure. Some Vedic scholars and priests, they saw these new philosophies as a direct threat to their authority, their way of life.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you've built your whole world around a certain belief system, it's got to be pretty unsettling to have it challenged like that.
Right. It's like your whole life's work, your social standing, even your livelihood suddenly being called into question.
Yeah, that's bound to create some tension.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just pushback, was it? I mean, Buddhism and Jainism, they didn't just disappear. Obviously, they resonated with people.
You're right, and that's where the synthesis comes in. It wasn't always this black and white us versus them situation. There were instances where elements of Buddhism and Jainism were absorbed into Vedic traditions.
So kind of blending, a fusion of ideas.
Exactly. People might have found ways to reconcile these different ideas. Maybe they started incorporating Buddhist meditation practices into their existing Vedic rituals. Finding ways to make it all work together.
So it wasn't necessarily an either situation.
Right. And what's really important to understand is that Buddhism and Jainism, even when they faced resistance, they forced those Vedic traditions to evolve. They sparked debate, they pushed boundaries. It's like, you've got this ancient well-established tree, and along come these new vines growing around it, sometimes competing for resources, sure, but also potentially providing support and allowing the tree to reach new heights.
So it wasn't just conflict, it was also about adaptation and growth. And that brings us to this idea of transformation.
Yeah.
How did this whole interaction between Vedic traditions and these new philosophies reshape the Indian worldview? What emerged from this period of, I guess you could call it philosophical ferment?
Well, I think one of the most significant outcomes was a much richer, much more diverse philosophical landscape in India. You have this incredible cross-pollination of ideas, leading to new interpretations of ancient texts, new schools of thought, new ways of understanding, what it means to be human.
So it's like this philosophical melting pot with all these
Yeah.
different ingredients simmering together, creating something new and complex.
That's a great way to put it. And one of the things that emerged from this melting pot was a more nuanced understanding of Dharma.
Oh, right, right. We talked about that earlier, the Vedic concept of Dharma, duty, and righteousness. But Buddhism and Jainism, they brought their own perspectives to that concept, didn't they?
They did.
So how did those different interpretations of Dharma kind of play out? Were there any specific areas where those ideas really clashed or maybe converged in unexpected ways?
Well, one area where we see this really fascinating interplay is in the realm of social ethics.
Okay, yeah.
The Vedas, if you remember, they laid the groundwork for the caste system, right? The system of social hierarchy that was deeply embedded in Indian society.
Right.
And that system, it had its own set of rules and obligations, its own understanding of Dharma, you could say. But both Buddhism and Jainism, they challenged those rigid social divisions. They emphasize the inherent worth of all beings, regardless of their social standing.
Well, that's a pretty radical idea for that time. It's like saying, it doesn't matter what family you're born into, you can still achieve enlightenment.
Exactly. And this idea, it resonated with people who felt marginalized by that whole caste system, people who were looking for a more egalitarian spiritual path. So you have this tension, right, between that Vedic Dharma, which was very much tied to your place in the hierarchy, and this new, more universal understanding of Dharma that was coming out of Buddhism and Jainism.
It's almost like these new philosophies were introducing cracks into that rigid social structure.
They were. And those cracks, they would continue to widen as Buddhism and Jainism gained more followers and, really spread their message.
Wow. So we're already seeing how these interactions had some pretty big implications, not just for philosophy, but for society as a whole.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that even as these new ideas were challenging the status quo, they were also being shaped by it.
Right. So it wasn't a one-way street, more like a dance back and forth, a lot of give and take.
Exactly. And that dance would continue for centuries, really
Wow.
shaping the intellectual and spiritual landscape of India and, even influencing the development of Hinduism as we know it today.
Okay, so we've got all of this dynamic interplay happening. Vedic traditions, Buddhism, Jainism, they're all in the mix. But, this was also a time of some pretty intense political change in India, right? Empires rising and falling, new powers emerging. I'm curious, how did that political landscape affect what was going on in the world of philosophy? Were there any connections between those two realms?
Oh, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, definitely. Political upheaval often creates fertile ground for new ideas. And in ancient India, the rise of these powerful new kingdoms like the Magadha Empire, they actually played a big role in the spread of Buddhism and Jainism.
Interesting. So it's like the political instability almost created an opening for these new philosophies to come in and challenge the established order.
Exactly. And these new empires, they were eager to legitimize their rule and to distinguish themselves from whoever came before. So they often embraced these new philosophies as a way to signal a break with the past, to show their commitment to a new era of justice, righteousness, all that.
So kind of a political PR move, you could
Yeah.
say, aligning yourself with these popular new movements to gain support and solidify your power.
You could definitely see it that way. And these new philosophies, they weren't just passively embraced by these rulers, they were actively promoted. Monasteries were built, scholars were patronized, missionaries were sent out to spread the message far and wide.
So it really was a two-way street, politics and philosophy influencing each other.
Absolutely. And that interplay, it had a huge impact on the course of Indian history, shaping everything from, social structures to cultural values to how people understood their place in the world. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
All right, so we've got Vedic traditions being challenged. We've got Buddhism and Jainism gaining ground.
Hmm.
We've got political upheavals creating opportunities for new ideas to spread. It's a lot to take in, but I'm curious, how did everyday people experience all this change? What did this philosophical ferment actually look like on the ground?
Okay, so imagine, right? You're living in ancient India. You're surrounded by these deeply ingrained Vedic beliefs and practices, and suddenly you start hearing these new ideas, these alternative paths to liberation. You might be drawn to that message of compassion and nonviolence that the Buddhists are preaching, or maybe you're intrigued by the Jain emphasis on asceticism, on self-discipline.
Is it like a whole menu of spiritual options has suddenly opened up?
Exactly, and people were making choices. They were debating, they were converting, they were forming new communities.
Sounds like a pretty exciting time to be alive, intellectually speaking.
It was. And this engagement wasn't limited to just the elites or scholars. These new philosophies, Buddhism and Jainism in particular, they appealed to people from all walks of life. Merchants, farmers, artisans, laborers, you name it.
Wow, so this was a real mass movement, a grassroots phenomenon.
Exactly. And that widespread appeal, it's reflected in the art and literature of the time. We see depictions of the Buddha and Jain Tirthankars everywhere, in sculptures, paintings, cave temples, even on household shrines.
So these new ideas were literally permeating every aspect of life, from the grandest temples to the most everyday objects.
They were, and that visual evidence, it gives us a glimpse into the lived experience of this time. It shows us that these new philosophies, they weren't just abstract concepts, they were tangible realities, shaping people's lives, their beliefs, their very identities.
This is all so fascinating. It's like a whole new world is opening up as we explore these interactions. But we've only just scratched the surface, right? There's still so much more to uncover, so many more stories to tell.
There are. And in our next segment, we'll delve even deeper into those specific ways that these different philosophies interacted, the points of conflict, the areas where they converged. We'll look at some of the key individuals who shaped these debates. And we'll explore the enduring legacy of this whole period of philosophical ferment.
I can't wait. Sounds like we're just getting started. All right, so we've laid some groundwork, right? We've got this really vibrant mix of Vedic traditions, Buddhism, Jainism, all kind of bumping up against each other in ancient India. Now, I want to dig into the specifics, like where were the real points of friction? Where were the areas of fusion between these philosophies? What were the big issues that were sparking all this debate?
Well, one of the most contentious areas was this whole concept of the self, the Atman. Remember we talked about how the Vedas, they said that the Atman, the individual self, it's ultimately the same as Brahman, that ultimate reality.
Right, like a spark of the divine within each being.
Exactly. And that was, that was central to their worldview, this idea of unity.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty comforting thought, right? Knowing that you're essentially one with the universe.
Yeah, I guess, for some. But both Buddhism and Jainism, they really challenged that idea.
Really?
Oh yeah, they rejected this whole notion of a permanent, unchanging Atman. For Buddhists, the self it's more like this impermanent collection of aggregates, constantly changing, and ultimately it's an illusion. And then for Jains, the focus was more on the individual soul's journey to liberation, shedding those karmic attachments and realizing its true nature.
Wow, so we're talking about some pretty fundamentally different conceptions of what it means to be human, to exist in this world. It's a big philosophical divide.
Oh, it is. And that difference in understanding the self, it kind of ripples out. It affected their views on everything, really. The nature of reality, the path to liberation, all of it.
Okay, so the self was a major point of divergence. But were there any areas of overlap, any places where these philosophies kind of found some common ground?
Well, one area where we see some interesting convergences is in the realm of ethics.
Oh,
All three traditions, Vedic, Buddhist, and Jain, they all really emphasize the importance of living a righteous life.
interesting.
Yeah, cultivating those virtues like compassion, nonviolence, truthfulness, self-control.
So even though they had these very different ideas about the self, about the nature of reality, they still agreed that, that living an ethical life was essential.
They did. And that shared emphasis on ethics, it's reflected in their codes of conduct. The Vedic tradition had the Dharma Shastras, those texts that laid out all the rules for righteous living. Buddhism had the 5 precepts and the Eightfold Path. Right action, right speech, right livelihood, all that. And Jainism had its own really rigorous code of conduct focused on minimizing harm to all living beings.
So it's really fascinating, right? On the one hand, they're debating these fundamental questions about the nature of existence. But on the other hand, they're also sharing this core set of ethical values.
Yeah, and that tension between, divergence and convergence, that's one of the things that makes this period so interesting to study. It wasn't just a simple clash of civilizations, it was much more nuanced, this real back and forth, this exchange of ideas.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture stuff, the self, ethics,
Mm.
but how did all this philosophical ferment, how did it play out in the everyday lives of people? Did it affect the way they worshipped, the way they interacted with each other?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most visible changes was in, how people actually practice their religion. The rise of Buddhism and Jainism, it really challenged the dominance of those Vedic sacrificial rituals, the ones that have been the cornerstone of religious life for centuries.
Right, right. So what did these new forms of religious practice look like?
Well, Buddhism, it really emphasized meditation, mindfulness, cultivating compassion. And that shift, it's really reflected in those Buddhist monasteries that started popping up all over, these places where people could gather to study, to meditate, to practice their faith together.
Right, and those monasteries, they really became centers of learning and cultural exchange, didn't they?
They did. And Jainism, with its emphasis on asceticism and nonviolence, that also had a huge impact. Jains, they developed their own really distinctive forms of worship, fasting, pilgrimage, this meticulous avoidance of harming any living thing. And that emphasis on nonviolence, it went beyond just religious practices. It started influencing social norms, ethical values in the wider society.
Wow. So these ideas were really starting to ripple outwards, affecting how people interacted with the world around them.
They were. And it wasn't just about, religious practices either. It was about social structures too. Remember, we talked about how the Vedic tradition was very much tied to that caste system. But Buddhism and Jainism, they both rejected that idea that your social status somehow determined your spiritual worth. They offered paths to liberation that were open to everyone, regardless of their birth.
So that's where those new ideas really start to challenge those deeply ingrained social hierarchies.
Exactly. And while they didn't dismantle the caste system overnight, they did offer these alternative social visions, that resonated with people who felt marginalized. And that, over time, contributed to a gradual shift in how people thought about social hierarchy.
Okay, so we've got these new philosophies challenging old ways of thinking. We've got new religious practices emerging. We've even got some subtle shifts in social structures starting to happen. But what about the Vedic tradition itself? How did it respond to all of this? Did they just kind of sit back and watch as these new ideas took root?
Well, it's important to remember that the Vedic tradition wasn't static. It wasn't just passively taking in these new influences. It was evolving too, adapting, finding ways to incorporate some of these new ideas while still holding on to its core identity.
Right, so there was a dialogue happening, a back and forth.
Exactly. And one way the Vedic tradition responded was by developing new schools of thought, new interpretations of their ancient texts that directly addressed some of the challenges that were being posed by Buddhism and Jainism.
So it wasn't just about resistance. It was about evolution, about finding new ways to articulate those core Vedic ideas in light of these new challenges.
Yeah. A good example of that is the development of the Upanishads.
Oh, right, the Upanishad.
Yeah, those philosophical texts that came out during this period. They delved into all these really profound questions about the nature of the self, the relationship between the individual and ultimate reality, the path to liberation.
So they're taking those core Vedic concepts and exploring them in new and innovative ways.
Exactly. And by doing so, they were not only responding to those challenges, but they were also enriching, expanding that Vedic tradition. It shows how even the most ancient traditions are capable of growth, of transformation.
It's really remarkable. Okay, so we've talked about the clash, the convergence, the transformation, but I'm curious about the lasting impact of all of this. How did those interactions between Vedic traditions, Buddhism, and Jainism, how did they really shape the course of Indian history and culture?
Well, one of the most significant outcomes was the emergence of Hinduism as we know it today.
Hinduism.
Yeah, Hinduism with its, all its different deities, the emphasis on karma, dharma, that vast mythology, it all has roots in this period.
So it's not like one tradition simply won out over the others. It's more like this blending, this synthesis that happened over centuries.
Exactly. And even though Buddhism eventually declined in India, it spread to other parts of Asia. and it became one of the world's major religions. And Jainism, with its focus on, nonviolence, ethical conduct, it's still thriving in India. It still influences everything from diet to social activism.
Wow, so the ripples of this era are still being felt, not just in India, but around the world.
They are. And one of the most important lessons, I think, that we can take away from this period is that cultural and intellectual exchange, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It's not about one tradition winning or losing. It's about that cross-pollination of ideas, that creative tension that happens when different perspectives come together.
So diversity, both intellectual and cultural, it's a source of strength, not weakness.
Exactly. And that's a lesson that's as relevant today as it was back then. In our world, we're all so interconnected. It's more important than ever to engage with different perspectives, to challenge our own assumptions, to embrace that richness and complexity.
All right, so we've explored this amazing period in ancient India, Vedic traditions, Buddhism, Jainism, all interacting, shaping each other. But before we wrap up, there's one more area I want to touch on. We've been talking about these big ideas, these beliefs, these philosophies. But what about the people who actually lived through this time? How did these philosophical shifts affect their daily lives, their choices, their sense of who they were?
That's a great point, and it's something that's often overlooked. It's easy to get caught up in the grand narratives, the big ideas, but history is really about people, those individuals who lived through these events, who made choices, who struggled, who found ways to make meaning.
So let's try to connect with those individuals. Let's imagine ourselves living in ancient India during this time. What would our lives have been like? What kind of choices might we have had to make?
Okay, so picture this. You're a person. You're growing up in a village, or maybe a city. And you've been raised in a family that follows the Vedic traditions. So you've learned about the gods and goddesses, the rituals, the sacrifices, the whole idea of fulfilling your dharma within your caste.
So it's a world that feels, I don't know, maybe familiar, stable, predictable.
Yeah, exactly. But then one day, a wandering ascetic comes to your village. He's talking about the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, the idea that you can actually escape suffering, that you can achieve enlightenment. Or maybe you hear about a Jain teacher who's talking about nonviolence, about the sanctity of all life.
So all of a sudden there's this new perspective, this different way of looking at the world.
Exactly. And you might be intrigued. You might be skeptical. You might be both at the same time. But you can't ignore these new ideas. They're spreading everywhere. You hear them in the marketplace. You hear them, maybe even in your own home.
So it's like these philosophies are creating this buzz, this sense of excitement, of possibility.
They are. And for some people, these new ideas were like a revelation, a call to action. They might have converted to Buddhism or Jainism, abandoned their old ways, embraced this new path. Maybe they joined a monastery or became wandering ascetics themselves, spreading the message.
So it's about agency, about people making choices, charting their own course.
Yeah. But for other people, the changes were more subtle. They might continue to follow those Vedic traditions, but with a new understanding. Maybe they incorporated some Buddhist meditation techniques or adopted some of those Jain principles of nonviolence.
So it wasn't always a complete break from the past.
Yeah.
It could also be about adaptation, integration.
Right. And for still others, these new ideas created, I don't know, maybe some confusion, even conflict. They might have clung even tighter to those traditional beliefs, seeing these new philosophies as a threat. They might have got into arguments, trying to defend what they believe, trying to refute the teachings of these new teachers.
So you've got this really dynamic interplay happening, this clash of ideas, this wrestling with beliefs. And it's happening at the individual level, within families, within communities.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where history really comes alive, where we see how those big ideas, those grand narratives, they actually played out in the lives of ordinary people. It reminds us that history is about choices, about how people adapt, how they resist, how they try to make sense of the world.
Okay, so we've explored this really fascinating period, right? We've seen how Vedic traditions interacted with these new philosophies, how it led to resistance, synthesis, transformation. We've looked at the key points of, where they agreed, where they disagreed. And we've even tried to connect with the people who lived through all of this.
And I think as we wrap up this deep dive, it's important to remember that this period wasn't just about those philosophical debates. It was about people, their beliefs, their hopes, their struggles. And by studying this period, by looking at it from all those different angles, we can gain a deeper understanding of what it means to be human.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that ideas have consequences. that they shape lives, that they shape societies.
They do. And as we try to make sense of our own complex world, I think there's a lot we can learn from this period. It teaches us about dialogue, about challenging our own assumptions, about embracing that diversity of thought and experience.
It's a message that feels more relevant than ever.
Yeah,
Thank you for taking us on this incredible journey.
it's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, I hope you'll continue to explore, to delve deeper into the history of India, to consider how the past continues to shape our present.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought. Given that both Vedic traditions and new philosophies like Buddhism and Jainism, they both emphasize Dharma, how did their understandings of duty and righteousness, how did they actually compare and contrast? How might those different interpretations influence how we think about our own responsibilities in the world today? Until next time, keep exploring. Wow, we've really been on quite the journey, haven't we? Back to ancient India, exploring how those Vedic traditions we talked about were interacting with these brand new philosophies like Buddhism and Jainism.
And you know what strikes me? It's both ancient history, right? But these debates about the self, about duty, about suffering, they feel so relevant to our lives even today.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And it wasn't just a war of words either. This was a time when those ideas were really put into practice, shaping communities, even whole kingdoms, and people's sense of self.
Okay, so let's zoom in on that for a second. How did these philosophical shifts play out in the real world, like for people actually living in ancient India? All right, try to imagine it, right? You're a merchant traveling on one of those ancient trade routes, crisscrossing India. You arrive in a new city. What do you see?
I'm picturing, I don't know, bustling markets, temples everywhere, lots of activity, the sights, the sounds, the smells of a busy city.
Exactly. But alongside all that, you might also notice something new. A Buddhist vihara, a monastery, with monks in their saffron robes, meditating, maybe even deep in debate. Or you might come across a Jain temple covered in those incredible carvings, illustrating the principles of ahimsa, nonviolence.
So these new philosophies are literally changing the landscape.
Yeah.
Like you can see them in the architecture of these cities.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it's not just about the physical space either. It's the social fabric too. Imagine you're invited to a gathering in the city. As you're talking to people, you might overhear conversations about the Buddha's teachings or maybe the Jain emphasis on ethical conduct. It's all around you.
So it's seeping into everyday conversations, changing the way people think and act.
Right. And it's not just talk either, it's action too. You might hear about a wealthy merchant who's funding the construction of a new vihara, a new Jain temple, or maybe sponsoring some public lectures by, some famous teacher.
So these philosophies are attracting followers, patrons even. People are putting their money where their beliefs are.
They are. And it wasn't limited to just the wealthy elite either. You might see artisans incorporating Buddhist or Jain symbols into their work, creating beautiful sculptures, paintings, even textiles.
It's like these ideas are finding their way into art, into creativity. They're becoming part of the culture.
Exactly. And it's through those subtle changes, those shifts in the fabric of society, that you really start to see how these weren't just abstract ideas, they were forces that were reshaping lives.
Okay, so we've got these new philosophies spreading, gaining followers, influencing art, architecture, even starting debates in the marketplace. But what about the people who are holding on to the Vedic traditions? Did they just sit back and watch all of this happen? Or was there pushback?
Oh, there was definitely pushback. Put yourself in the shoes of a Vedic priest. Right. For generations, your family's been conducting these elaborate rituals, passing down the sacred knowledge. Now these new teachers come along, they're challenging the authority of the Vedas, questioning those rituals, and worst of all, they're taking away your followers.
Yeah, that's got to feel threatening. Like your whole world is being turned upside down.
Right, so some of those Vedic scholars, those priests, they responded by engaging in these huge debates, trying to defend their traditions, even reinterpreting those ancient texts.
So like a philosophical arms race. Each side trying to sharpen their arguments and win people over.
Exactly. And what's interesting is out of that clash, you see new schools of thought emerging within the Vedic tradition itself.
So it's not just resistance, it's evolution too.
Yeah.
The Vedic tradition is finding new ways to express those core ideas.
Yeah. A great example is the development of the Upanishads.
Oh yeah, the Upanishads, those are some deep philosophical texts.
They are. And they came about during this time exploring questions about the self, the relationship between the individual and the ultimate reality, that path to liberation.
So they're taking those core Vedic concepts, but like looking at them in a new light.
Exactly. It shows that even the most ancient traditions can change and grow. And, they were not only responding to those challenges from Buddhism and Jainism, but they were also enriching their own tradition.
Okay, so we've seen the resistance, the adaptation, this amazing burst of intellectual creativity. As we wrap up our deep dive, I'm curious, what were some of the lasting legacies of this era? How did these interactions between these different schools of thought shape India?
Well, one of the biggest legacies is the emergence of Hinduism as we know it today.
Hinduism.
Yeah, with all its different deities, the focus on karma and dharma, its incredibly rich mythology, it's all rooted in this period.
So it wasn't about one tradition winning. It was more like a mixing, a combining of ideas over time.
Exactly. And Buddhism, even though it declined in India, it spread to other parts of Asia, became a major world religion. And Jainism, with its emphasis on, nonviolence, ethical conduct, it still thrives in India today.
So it's like those ripples are still being felt, even now.
They are. And if there's one lesson we can take away from this, it's that the sharing of ideas, that exchange, it's not a competition. It's about that back and forth, that creative tension when different perspectives come together.
So it's that reminder that diversity of thought, of culture, it makes us stronger.
Absolutely. And that's as important today as it was back then. In our interconnected world, it's more important than ever to engage with different viewpoints, challenge ourselves, embrace complexity.
It's a powerful message, and it gives me a lot of hope. Thank you so much for taking us on this incredible journey. I feel like I've learned so much, and I've got even more questions now.
It's been my pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, because it's that curiosity, that willingness to learn from different perspectives. That's how we really come to appreciate the richness of human history and culture. And who knows, you might even learn something new about yourself along the way.
And that's a wrap for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you next time.